Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at Why Evolution is True by Jerry Coyne. This book was published in 2009, so fairly recent, and it is essentially a defense of Darwinism. Why evolution is true, pretty self-explanatory. It goes through all sorts of evidence, genetic evidence, the fossil record, all sorts of aspects of biology and archaeology, and the study of animal behavior and the study of humans and human behavior to kind of reinforce the theory of evolution. It provides a whole lot of evidence in favor of evolution. I'm a believer in evolution. If you're a listener of the show, you know this. And so I don't really want to take much time contending with the various supports for evolution. I've already done several books on evolution. I've assumed from the beginning that evolution is correct. And so I'm not gonna dive into those portions of it. There's some good sections here about kind of the fundamentals of what evolution is and how it works. That's very interesting, but I've already talked about some of the basic principles of evolution in the episode on the selfish gene and part 1 of Darwinism and Human Affairs. That went into some detail about the basic fundamentals of how evolution works. So that's not what I want to talk about today either. There are a few sections here that I want to discuss in particular. One of them is Chapter 6, How Sex Drives Evolution. And here we get to look at sexual selection, which is the second portion of evolution. Part of evolution is driven by natural selection. In other words, differential survival rates based on traits that individual organisms have that allows them to makes them more likely to survive and more likely to procreate on account of their survival. And the second driving factor of evolution is sexual selection. And this is where certain animals and creatures will have access to mating and others won't. Some of them will be more prolific and others won't. This comes about through a couple different mechanisms that we'll look at in those sections. And the other section that I want to talk about is Chapter 9, Evolution Redux. This talks more about morality, and it brings up evolutionary psychology. And that's some interesting stuff, I think, as well. Pertains to some of the other episodes and that I've done and some of the things that have been important components of the podcast. So those are the parts I want to read. If you are interested in a thorough defense of evolutionary theory, I would advise you to pick the book up. But those parts, I'm going to skip over those parts and just talk about those 2 chapters that I mentioned. So without any further ado, I'm going to get in, like all my episodes, read a couple sections here and have a little bit of commentary about it. And I'll start with reading here about sexual dimorphism, which is the difference in physique between men and women. Now, obviously, there's a difference because males and females produce different types of gametes. They have different actions that they engage in when engaging in sexual intercourse, and so they always have different genitalia. But that's only a portion of sexual dimorphism. What we're really looking at is the rest of the body. How does the body differ between males and females of various species? And they don't always differ in the same way, obviously, but there's often a difference in the rest of the body between males and females, and what is the reason for that, and how is that evolutionarily acquired, and what does that have to? What are the implications of that on animal behavior? Because the different physiques between male and female creatures is often related to different behaviors between male and female creatures. So I want to look at that a little bit. I've kind of hinted at this a little bit in some previous shows, but always put it off. I guess today's the day we'll begin to open up this can of worms. So he says, quote, traits that differ between males and females of a species, such as tails, color, and songs, are called sexual dimorphisms, from the Greek for two forms. Over and over, biologists have found that sexually dimorphic traits in males seem to violate evolutionary theory, for they waste time and energy and reduce survival. Colorful male guppies are eaten more often than are the plainer females. The male black wheat ear, a Mediterranean bird, laboriously erects large cairns of stones in various locations, piling up 50 times his own weight in pebbles over a period of 2 weeks. Male sage grouse perform elaborate displays, strutting up and down the prairie, flapping their wings and making loud sounds from 2 large vocal sacs. These shenanigans can use up a tremendous amount of energy for a bird. One day's display burns up the caloric equivalent of a banana split. If selection is responsible for these traits, and it should be given their complexity, we need to explain how. Before Darwin, sexual dimorphism was a mystery. Creationists, then as now, could not explain why a supernatural designer should produce features in one sex and only one sex that harm its survival. As the great explainer of nature's diversity, Darwin was naturally anxious to understand how these seemingly pointless traits evolved. He finally noticed the key to their explanation. If traits differ between males and females of a species, the elaborate behaviors, structures, and ornaments are nearly always restricted to males. By now you might have guessed how these costly traits evolved. Remember that the currency of selection is not really survival, but selective reproduction. Having a fancy tail or a seductive song doesn't help you survive, but it may increase your chances of having offspring, and that's how these flamboyant traits and behaviors arose. Darwin was the first to recognize this trade-off, and coined the name for the type of selection responsible for sexually dimorphic features: sexual selection. Sexual selection is simply selection that increases an individual's chance of getting a mate. It's really just a subset of natural selection, but one that deserves its own chapter because of the unique way it operates and the seemingly non-adaptive adaptations it produces. Sexually selected traits evolve if they more than offset the male's diminished survival with an increase in his reproduction. Maybe widow birds with longer tails don't evade predators very well, but females might prefer the longer-tailed males as mates. Deer with bigger antlers might struggle to survive under a metabolic burden, but perhaps they win jousting contests more frequently, thereby siring more offspring. Sexual selection comes in 2 forms. One, exemplified by the Irish elk's huge antlers, is direct competition between males for access to females. The other, the one that produces the widow bird's long tail, is female choosiness among possible mates. Male-male competition, or in Darwin's oft-pugnacious terminology, the law of battle, is the easiest to understand. As Darwin noted, it is certain that with almost all animals, there is a struggle between the males for the possession of the female. When males of a species battle it out directly, be it through the clashing antlers of deer, the stabbing horns of the stag beetle, the head-butting of stalk-eyed flies, or the bloody battles of massive elephant seals, they win access to females by driving off competitors. Selection will favor any trait that promotes such victories, so long as the increased chance of getting mates more than offsets any reduced survival. This kind of selection produces armaments, stronger weapons, larger body size, or anything that helps a male win physical contests. In contrast, features such as bright colors, ornaments, bowers, and mating displays are molded by the second type of sexual selection, mate choice. To female eyes, it seems, not all males are the same. They find some male traits and behaviors more attractive than others, so genes that produce these features accumulate in populations. There is also an element of competition between males in this scenario, but it is indirect. Winning males have the loudest voices, the brightest colors, the most alluring pheromones, the sexiest displays, and so on. But in contrast to male-male competition, here the winner is decided by the females. In both types of sexual selection, males compete for females. Why isn't it the other way around? We'll learn shortly that it all rests on the difference in size between 2 tiny cells, the sperm and the egg. End quote. Okay, so here you have the basics of sexual selection and sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism being, as I said, the difference in body shape between males and females, and sexual selection being the mechanism by which different individual creatures have differing rates of reproduction above and beyond their survival rates. And so we see sexual selection itself is divided into two types. You have direct competition between males for access to females. And this is the competition between male elephant seals, these bloody battles, and the winning male elephant seal winds up with a harem of female elephant seals, and the losing male elephant seal has none. And this happens of some greater or lesser degree of competition between all sorts of species. Deer battling each other with their antlers. All sorts of species have this competition between males for access to females. But we don't see, he says, why does this all happen among males? We don't see the same sort of female physical competition for access to males. Why is that the case? And he says it comes down to the sperm and the egg and the differences between the one and the other. The difference between the shape and operation of a sperm and the shape and operation of an egg. The whole structure of the physiques of these animals, and this includes humans. Humans have sexual dimorphism too. Human males are larger than human females. We have more muscle mass, and we have more physical power than females. And this is a direct result of these same forces applying to humans, right? Male competition with one another for access to females. And we've evolved this. We inherited it from our primordial ancestors, but we didn't eliminate it. This has continued to be a factor in humans, and some species have large differences between males and females, and these species have a lot of male-on-male competition. The male elephant seal is like twice as long and like 4 times as heavy as a female elephant seal. That's much greater than the difference between human males and females, because our male competition is not anywhere near as vicious and aggressive as the elephant seal, and we don't have the same sort of harems of women that elephant seals have. Monogamous creatures have less male against male competition because each male pairs with a female, and so they don't have the sort of harems where one male gets all of the females and the other male gets none. Usually one male gets one and the other male gets another. And those creatures don't have the same sort of sexual dimorphism in that way because there isn't as much competition for the access to females. And so these things are sort of correlated. The level of polygyny and the amount of difference between males and females, those are correlated features. And so you can see that among humans there is some competition, but not as much as in some other animals. The other being female choosiness, the other type of sexual selection being female choosiness. And this is, I think, incredibly interesting because it's more complicated. Females choose... he talks about, I believe, the widow bird with the long tail. The classic example here, he does talk about this as well in a section that I haven't quoted, is about the peacock and the peacock tail, and how male peacocks have this big, bright tail. And it's not an adaptive trait. It doesn't benefit the male peacock to have this tail. It makes it hard for them to fly. They live in the trees. They roost in the trees. And they have a harder time getting up into the tree because of this tail. They're expending resources, calories and biological resources towards this big useless tail that could be spent toward other features that would make them more able to survive. So they're diverting resources away from their survivability into these elaborate displays. And so that seems odd, right? Why is this happening? How is this happening? And the females are choosing male peacocks that have these bright displays. Because why? That's the big question. Why do females prefer this over males that don't have it? And the answer is generally something along the lines of healthy males are capable of having these big tails, and less healthy males are less capable. They have less calories that they can devote to the creation of the tail. They have less capability of overcoming the downside of having the tail. So a male that has a bright tail with a lot of colors and stuff is a well-fed male, essentially. It's a male that has good genes. It's a male that's healthy. And that is the sort of male that the female peacock wants, the peahen. That's the sort of male that she's after, is one that has the capability of doing this. So this is really kind of gets into sort of strange phenomena. And we'll look into that in a little bit more detail. But I think it's interesting because this kind of points to not only biological differences, but behavioral differences, right? The females don't behave, female deer don't behave the way male deer behave. They don't engage in the competition for access to males. Their behavior is different. It's not only that their biology is different, their behavior is different. What a female peahen is attracted to in a male peacock is different from what a male peacock is attracted to in a peahen, right? Their bodies are different and their behaviors are different, and the differences between their bodies and the differences between their behaviors are related. And this has implications for humans that many humans have no interest in acknowledging. A lot of people just seem to think that men and women are basically the same except for their genitalia. That's really the only real difference, is what's in your pants. And clearly there's much more difference than just what's in your pants. Your whole body is different, and your body's different because it does different things, and your behaviors are different. And animal behaviors are different between males and females, and there's really no reason that we should expect humans to be any different. Human behaviors are different between males and females. Now, we're not as sexually dimorphic as some animal species, so maybe our behaviors aren't as different as you would find in some other species. But they're there. Our bodies are different, our behaviors are different. And our desires are different. What we find attractive in mates is different. What men are looking for in a woman is not the same thing as what women are looking for in a man. This is something that a lot of people, unfortunately, they don't learn when they're young. They don't realize they're taught this like liberal agenda that says that men and women are basically the same, except for except for the genitalia. Or then you might say, for someone who's a little bit less extreme, well, their bodies are different, but their minds are the same. Anything a man can do, a woman can do. Anything a woman can do, a man can do. Your brain is the same. It's just some sort of like superfluous physical characteristics that may be different. But who you are on the inside is really basically the same. Unless you're transgender, in which who you are on the inside is contrary to your physicality. But it's very rare that we would say who you are on the inside is aligned with your physicality. In other words, that you're a man, you have a man's brain, or you're a woman and you have a woman's brain. Such things are kind of taboo, but to say you're a woman with a man's brain, suddenly that makes sense, even though it really doesn't make any sense. There are no male animals with female animal brains. They might vary in their behavior. You might have males that are more aggressive or less aggressive, but males are males and females are females in the entire animal kingdom, and that includes us. So again, this comes down to the sperm and the egg. And when people say, like, what's the difference between men and women? And they come up with, first of all, the gender expression is the difference. Or you might come back to biology and say, well, males have these sort of traits. And if a female like has more body hair or has some facial hair of some sort, that suddenly whether they're a man or a woman is called into question. But the reality is that there are only two sexual cells, sexual gametes, the sperm and the egg. That's it, two. And any creature that produces sperm is male, and any creature that produces an egg is female. And that's what it comes down to. It's not about the chromosomes, the XX or XY chromosome, such that an XXX or XYX or some anomaly, some chromosomal anomaly, creates something else. You either create sperm, in which you're a male, you create eggs, in which you're a female, you have a disorder that doesn't create anything, in which case you are an evolutionary dead end. You have some sort of biological deformation, and the best guess would be what does your genitalia resemble, right? And then in some, I don't even know if this exists, some type of intersexual anomaly where you produce sperm and eggs. I'm not even sure if that is a real thing, but nevertheless, you are a genetic anomaly. You've got some sort of deformity. You're not a third sex. Those people aren't third sexes. The sexes are pretty straightforward. You produce a sperm, or you have the genital capabilities which would, under normal circumstances, produce a sperm, or you produce an egg and or have the necessary genital structures to produce an egg. And that's it. It's straightforward. Eggs and sperm, 1, 2. Everything is built around that because that's how sex works. Every procreative act involves a sperm and an egg and fertilization through the combination of those two. That's it. So in a little bit more detail about that, he says, quote, "The theory of why the two sexes have different numbers and sizes of gametes is messy. This condition presumably evolved from that in earlier sexually reproducing species in which the two sexes had gametes of equal size. Theoreticians have shown rather convincingly that natural selection will favor changing this ancestral state into a state in which one sex, the one we call male, makes a lot of small gametes, sperm or pollen, and the other, female, makes fewer but larger gametes, known as eggs. It's this asymmetry in the size of gametes that sets the stage for all sexual selection, for it causes the two sexes to evolve different mating strategies. Take males. A male can produce large quantities of sperm, and so can potentially father a huge number of offspring, limited only by the number of females he can attract and the competitive ability of his sperm. Things are different for females. Eggs are expensive and limited in number, and if a female mates many times over a short period, she does little, if anything, to increase her number of offspring. A vivid demonstration of this difference can be seen by looking up the record number of children sired by a human female versus a male. If you were to guess the maximum number of children that a woman could produce in a lifetime, you might say around 15. Guess again. The Guinness Book of World Records gives the official record number of children for a woman at 69, produced by an 18th century Russian peasant. In 27 pregnancies, between 1725 and 1745, she had 16 pairs of twins, 7 sets of triplets, and 4 sets of quadruplets. She presumably had some physiological or genetic predisposition to multiple births. One weeps for this belabored woman, but her record is far surpassed by that of a male, one Mulai Ishmael, an emperor of Morocco. Ishmael was reported by Guinness as having fathered at least 342 daughters and 525 sons, and by 1721 he was reputed to have 700 male descendants. Even at these extremes, then, males outstrip females more than tenfold. The evolutionary difference between males and females is a matter of differential investment. Investment in expensive eggs versus cheap sperm. Investment in pregnancy, when females retain and nourish the fertilized eggs, and investment in parental care, in the many species in which females alone raise the young. For males, mating is cheap. For females, it's expensive. For males, a mating costs only a small dose of sperm. For females, it costs much more. The production of large, nutrient-rich eggs, and often a huge expenditure of energy and time. In more than 90% of mammal species, a male's only investment in offspring is his sperm, for females provide all the parental care. This asymmetry between males and females in potential numbers of mates and offspring leads to conflicting interests when it comes time to choose a mate. Males have little to lose by mating with a substandard female, say one who is weak or sickly, because they can easily mate again and repeatedly. Selection then favors genes that make a male promiscuous, relentlessly trying to mate with nearly any female, or anything bearing the slightest resemblance to a female. Male sage grouse, for instance, sometimes try to mate with piles of cow manure. And as we learned earlier, some orchids get pollinated by luring randy males to copulate with their petals. Females are different. Because of their higher investment in eggs and offspring, their best tactic is to be picky rather than promiscuous. Females must make each opportunity count by choosing the best possible father to fertilize their limited number of eggs. They should, therefore, inspect potential mates very closely. What this adds up to is that, in general, males must compete for females. Males should be promiscuous, females coy. The life of a male should be one of internecine conflict, constantly vying with his fellows for mates. The good males, either more attractive or more vigorous, will often secure a large number of mates. They will presumably be preferred by more females, too, while substandard males go unmated. Almost all females, on the other hand, will eventually find mates. Since every male is competing for them, their distribution of mating success will be more even. Biologists describe this difference by saying that the variance in mating success should be higher for males than females. Is it? Yes. We often see such a difference. In the red deer, for example, the variation among males in how many offspring they leave during their lifetime is 3 times higher than that of females. The disparity is even greater for elephant seals, in which fewer than 10% of all males leave any offspring over several breeding seasons, compared to more than half of the females. The difference between males and females in their potential number of offspring drives the evolution of both male-male competition and female choice. Males must compete to fertilize a limited number of eggs. That's why we see the law of battle, the direct competition between males to leave their genes to the next generation. And that is also why males are colorful or have displays, mating calls, bowers, and the like, for that is their way of saying, pick me, pick me. And it is ultimately female preference that drives the evolution of longer tails, more vigorous displays, and louder songs in males. Now, the scenario I have just described is a generalization, and there are exceptions. Some species are monogamous, with both males and females providing parental care. Evolution can favor monogamy if males have more offspring by helping with childcare than if they abandon their offspring to seek more matings. In many birds, for example, 2 full-time parents are required. When one goes off to forage, the other incubates the eggs. But monogamous species are not that common in the wild. Only 2% of all mammal species, for instance, have this type of mating system. End quote. Okay, so there you have the difference between sperm and eggs and all of the various downstream consequences. And it's very simple if you think about it, especially it's not just the biological resources that go into creating the egg. It's a single cell. But women have a limited number of eggs. They don't have tons of them, and they're not constantly creating more of them. They're generally not producing an endless stream of eggs. They're producing a limited stream of eggs. And they can only get pregnant a limited number of times. They have a lot that goes into it. If a woman gets pregnant, there's a lot involved, especially for humans who have potential complications from birth, more so than other animals have, on account of our large brains. But the point is that females, biologically, because they have an egg that stays in one place, and so it doesn't wander off, right? The male sperm wanders off into the female, and the gestation period happens in the female. In almost all cases, the seahorse being the notable exception. But in almost all cases, gestation occurs inside of the female's body. So the female has to go through the pregnancy and oftentimes is in a somewhat incapacitated state in the later stages of the pregnancy. She's not as capable of hunting. She's not as capable of doing various things. Everything becomes more difficult for her. And then she has the child, and in most cases, the female takes on all or the vast majority of responsibility of raising the young. And the male is long gone by the time the baby arrives. And this is the case throughout nature. except in very few species. So how a female views having sex and risking pregnancy is very different than how a male views having sex and risking pregnancy. There's minimal risk for males. There's minimal investment for males. So the biology drives different behavior. We can expect from an evolutionary standpoint, we can expect males to be more promiscuous, males to be after more quantity, and females to be after more quality. Now, technology in humans has allowed females to be more promiscuous, and our culture is more monogamous, and so we have a tendency to pair up with one female, and there are a multitude of reasons for this. Some are cultural, some are biological. But the fundamentals remain that for humans, as much as for animals, there's a much greater investment for females, especially with human young not being able to just go trot off and do its own thing, a couple hours after birth. The period of raising young in humans is astonishingly long. And technology has allowed us to escape the biological constraints that we have evolved under. But we haven't evolved the habits, we haven't evolved the behavioral patterns that would go along with completely removing ourselves from our the environment in which we acquired these evolutionary traits. And so, in a sense, when technology disrupts our natural patterns of behavior by disrupting our natural biology, all sorts of unforeseen consequences can come downstream from that, because we're not just the same. And if you give females the capacity to live their lives as males, it doesn't mean that their brains are hardwired to operate the way males operate. There's a sort of strange distortion that occurs, and the consequences of that strange distortion are unknown, able to be predicted, but extremely controversial as well, and oftentimes don't really want to be discussed or examined. It's so much easier to just say, well, men and women are basically the same. If you give women all of the capacities, rights, biological capacities to do everything men do, then because they're essentially the same, they'll behave the same. We should know better than that, but we don't. So moving on from there, he talks a little bit more about female choosiness and says, quote, "What does a female have to gain by choosing a particular male? There are two answers. She can benefit directly, that is, by picking a male who will help her produce more or healthier young during the act of childcare, or she can benefit indirectly by choosing a male who has better genes than those of other males, that is, genes that will give her offspring a leg up in the next generation. Either way, the evolution of female preference will be favored by selection, natural selection. Take direct benefits. A gene that tells a female to mate with males holding better territories gives her offspring who are better nourished or occupy better nests. They will survive better and reproduce more than young who were not brought up in good territories. This means that the population of young will contain a higher proportion of females carrying the preference gene than it did in the previous generation. As generations pass and evolution continues, every female will eventually carry preference genes. And if there are other mutations that increase preference for better territories, those too will increase in frequency. Over time, the preference for males with better territories will evolve to be stronger and stronger. And this, in turn, selects on the males to compete more strongly for territories. The female preference evolves hand in hand with the male competition for real estate. Genes that give indirect benefits to choosy females will also spread. Imagine that a male has genes that make him more resistant than other males to disease. A female who mates with such a male will have offspring that are also more disease resistant. This gives her an evolutionary benefit in choosing that male. Now imagine as well that there is a gene that enables females to identify these healthier males as mates. If she mates with such a male, that mating will produce sons and daughters who carry both types of genes, those for disease resistance as well as those for preferring males with disease resistance. In each generation, the most disease-resistant individuals who reproduce better will also carry genes that tell females to choose the most resistant males. As those resistance genes spread by natural selection, the genes for female preference piggyback along with them. In this way, both female preference and disease resistance increase throughout a species. Both of these scenarios explain why females prefer certain kinds of males, but not why they prefer certain features of those males like bright colors or elaborate plumage. This probably happens because those particular features tell the female that a male will provide larger direct or indirect benefits. Let's look at a few examples of female choice. The house finch of North America is sexually dimorphic for color. Females are brown, but males have bright colors on their head and breast. Males don't defend territories but do show parental care. Jeff Hill at the University of Michigan found that in one local population, males varied in color from pale yellow through orange to bright red. Wanting to see if color affected reproductive success, he used hair dyes to make males brighter or paler. Sure enough, brighter males obtained significantly more mates than paler ones. And among unmanipulated birds, females deserted the nests of lighter males more often than the nests of brighter males. Why do female finches prefer brighter males? In the same population, Hill showed that brighter males feed their young more often than do lighter males. Females thus get a direct benefit in the form of better provisioning of their offspring by choosing brighter males. Females mated to lighter males might abandon their nests because the young aren't adequately fed. And why do brighter males bring more food? Probably because brightness is a sign of overall health. The red color of male finches comes entirely from carotenoid pigments in the seeds they eat. They can't make this pigment on their own. Brighter males are therefore better fed, and probably healthier in general. Females seem to choose bright males simply because the color tells them, I'm a male who is better able to stock the family larder. Any genes that make females prefer brighter males gives those females a direct benefit, and so selection would increase that preference. And with the preference in place, any male who is better at converting seeds into bright plumage would also get an advantage because he'll secure more mates. Over time, sexual selection will exaggerate a male's red color. The females stay drab because they gain no benefit from being bright. Indeed, they could suffer by being more conspicuous to predators. There are other direct benefits to choosing a healthy and vigorous male. Males can carry parasites or diseases that they can transmit to females, their young, or both. And so it's to a female's advantage to avoid these males. A male's color, plumage, and behavior can be a clue to whether he's diseased or infested. Only healthy males can sing a loud song, perform a vigorous display, or grow a bright, handsome set of feathers. If males of a species are normally bright blue, for example, you'd best avoid mating with a pale male. Evolutionary theory shows that females should prefer any trait showing that a male will be a good father. All that's required is that there be some genes increasing the preference for that trait, and that variation in the expression of the trait gives a clue to the male's condition. The rest follows automatically. In sage grouse, parasitic lice produce spots of blood on the male's vocal sac, a feature prominently displayed as a swollen translucent pouch while they're strutting on the lek. Males who have artificial blood spots painted onto their vocal sacs get significantly fewer matings. The spots may tip off females that a male is infested, and would literally be a lousy father. Selection will favor genes that promote not only the female preference for unspotted sacs, but also the male trait that indicates his condition. The male's vocal sac will get bigger, and the female's preference for the plain vocal sac will increase. This can lead to the evolution of highly exaggerated features in males, like the ludicrously long tail of the widow bird. The whole process stops only when the male trait becomes so exaggerated that any further increase reduces his survival more than it attracts females, so that his net production of offspring suffers. What about female preferences that give indirect benefits? The most obvious such benefit is what a male always gives to his offspring, his genes. And the same type of traits that show a male is healthy could also show that he's genetically well endowed. Males with brighter colors, longer tails, or louder calls may be able to display these features only if they have genes that make them survive or reproduce better than their competitors. Likewise, for males able to build elaborate bowers or pile up large cairns of stones. You can imagine many features that could show a male has genes for greater survival or greater ability to reproduce. Evolutionary theory shows that in these cases, 3 types of genes will all increase in frequency together. Genes for a male indicator trait, reflecting that he has good genes. Genes that make a female prefer that indicator trait. And of course, the good genes whose presence is reflected by the indicator. This is a complex scenario, but most evolutionary biologists consider it the best explanation for elaborate male traits and behaviors. End quote. Okay, so that was a long section, and there's a lot there. But essentially, there's 2 types of benefits that females get when they're being choosy among their mates. One of them is the direct benefit, and this is when a male can provide for the female or provide for the offspring directly by bringing food, by creating a structure for the female and the offspring to live in, for being territorial to keep competitors away, which would enable that male to have more access to food because he has more territory in which to acquire food. Various things that the male creature can provide for the female creature or for the offspring. Resources, right? Resources. Females will choose males capable of providing resources to the female and her offspring. The indirect benefit is genetic. Females will choose males that have indicators that they have good genes, that they have a good genetic code. Now, the female doesn't benefit directly from the genetic code. The offspring don't benefit directly during their youth, generally speaking, for the genetic code. They may be healthier offspring, but what really comes down to is like the offspring's life as a whole. The offspring will be better able to be mothers and fathers. The offspring will be healthier. This is a benefit that only the offspring have. It's an indirect benefit. It's a genetic benefit. The female's after good genes. So the direct benefit is the female's after resources, and the indirect benefit is the female's after good genes. Obviously, there's overlap here. A male capable of providing resources is going to have the genetics necessary for that capacity. And those good genetic codes are going to translate into a male's ability to provide resources. There's a lot of overlap here, but you can see where there's also a distinction. And in this section, that may have been a little over elaborate in how the ability to identify the males, the tendency to prefer the male's genetic code, the male's tendency to display indicators of its genetic code. All these things work in tandem, and they kind of create a cycle of more. The female has more preference, the male has more indicator, the female has more preference, the male has more indicator. It snowballs until it reaches a point at which displaying any further indicators is too detrimental to the male. The bright spots are using up too much of its resources, are being diverted to this sort of bright display or whatever it may be that the female is after, becomes detrimental to the male to a point where it's no longer beneficial to try to continue on in that manner. And that's all the section on sex differences that I wanted to read, but it is really interesting to me to kind of translate this to humans because as he'll mention later, we don't really have the same sort of displays. We do tend to have various ways that males display their resources, can kind of show off with flashy cars or other mechanisms of showing how much resources we have, showing what our capabilities of being providers, our capability of providing direct resources to females, our capability of displaying that we have good genes. But at the same time, women also do a lot of decoration and display and attempts to attract attention from males. So in a way, that would presume that males have a choosiness to them as well. That women can't just be there and just assume that every male is going to want to pursue them. So there's a bit of male choosiness that prompts women to have their own displays to attempt to attract the attention of males. And I think certainly this partly comes with our monogamy, our institution of marriage. If men are not out there inseminating every female they come across, but they're expected to settle down with one and have a family with one woman rather than many, that prompts a male toward a sense of choosiness that he normally wouldn't really have. So because we have this culturally enforced norm, and I don't think it's just culturally enforced. I mean, there are animals that mate for life. There are animals that are more or less monogamous. There's adultery in the animal world, but more or less these animals are monogamous. There's no reason to believe that humans, especially given the fact that our sexual dimorphism is not on the extreme end, that we have a genetic tendency toward monogamy as well. At least in some degree, especially also given the long period of child rearing and the difficulties of birth and the restraints upon pregnant females. If there was no assistance from males, if we were just totally promiscuous and didn't pair up with females and provide them with resources for their children and for them to be able to go through the pregnancy without concern, for their ability to acquire food and things like that. If we didn't participate in the raising of children, our children would be at a severe disadvantage, just because of the complexity and the length of time it takes, and the amount of resources that child rearing in humans requires. So that would be an evolutionary drive that we would have in that regard toward monogamy, toward male participation in child rearing. But it does anytime that there's male investment, the more male investment in child rearing that a species engages in, the more likely it is that males themselves have to be a bit more choosy. And in that circumstance, I think females would have to take on some sort of indicators of genetic viability themselves, not just the males. Anyway, that's all about that topic. I do want to cover another section here where he talks about morality. And I'm going to try not to spend a tremendous amount of time on this because I've talked about these things, the relationship between evolution and morality before. But I think it's just really important and a question that's not entirely answered as to what are the ramifications of evolutionary theory on our morality. That's a huge question. So here he says, quote, "When we say that evolution is true, what we mean is that the major tenets of Darwinism have been verified. Organisms evolved. They did so gradually. Lineages split into different species from common ancestors, and natural selection is the major engine of adaptation. No serious biologist doubts these propositions. But this doesn't mean that Darwinism is scientifically exhausted, with nothing left to understand. Far from it. Evolutionary biology is teeming with questions and controversies. How exactly does sexual selection work? Do females select males with good genes? How much of a role does genetic drift, as opposed to natural or sexual selection, play in the evolution of DNA sequences or the features of organisms? Which fossil hominins are in the direct line to Homo sapiens? What caused the Cambrian explosion of life, in which many new types of animals appeared within only a few million years? Critics of evolution seize upon these controversies, arguing that they show that something is wrong with the theory of evolution itself. But this is specious. There is no dissent among serious biologists about the major claims of evolutionary theory, only about the details of how evolution occurred and about the relative roles of various evolutionary mechanisms. Far from discrediting evolution, the controversies are in fact the sign of a vibrant, thriving field. What moves science forward is ignorance, debate, and the testing of alternative theories with observations and experiments. A science without controversy is a science without progress. At this point, I could simply say, I've given the evidence, and it shows that evolution is true, QED. But I'd be remiss if I did that, because many people require more than just evidence before they'll accept evolution. To these folks, evolution raises such profound questions of purpose, morality, and meaning that they just can't accept it, no matter how much evidence they see. It's not that we evolved from apes that bothers them so much, it's the emotional consequences of facing that fact. And unless we address those concerns, we won't progress in making evolution a universally acknowledged truth. As the American philosopher Michael Ruse noted, nobody lies awake worrying about gaps in the fossil record. Many people lie awake worrying about abortion and drugs and the decline of the family and gay marriage and all of the other things that are opposed to so-called moral values. Nancy Pearcey, a conservative American philosopher and advocate of intelligent design, expressed this common fear. Why does the public care so passionately about a theory of biology? Because people sense intuitively that there's much more at stake than a scientific theory. They know that when naturalistic evolution is taught in the science classroom, then a naturalistic view of ethics will be taught down the hallway in the history classroom, the sociology classroom, the family life classroom, and in all areas of the curriculum. Pearcey argues, and many American creationists agree, that all the perceived evils of evolution come from two worldviews that are part of science, naturalism and materialism. Naturalism is the view that the only way to understand our universe is through the scientific method. Materialism is the idea that the only reality is the physical matter of the universe, and that everything else, including thoughts, will, and emotions, comes from physical laws acting on that matter. The message of evolution, and all of science, is one of naturalistic materialism. Darwinism tells us that, like all species, human beings arose from the working of blind, purposeless forces over eons of time. As far as we can determine, the same forces that gave rise to ferns, mushrooms, lizards, and squirrels also produced us. Now, science cannot completely exclude the possibility of supernatural explanation. It is possible, though very unlikely, that our whole world is controlled by elves. But supernatural explanations like these are simply never needed. We manage to understand the natural world just fine, using reason and materialism. Furthermore, supernatural explanations always mean the end of inquiry. That's the way God wants it, end of story. Science, on the other hand, is never satisfied. Our studies of the universe will continue until humans go extinct. But Pearcey's notion that these lessons of evolution will inevitably spill over into the study of ethics, history, and family life is unnecessarily alarmist. How can you derive meaning, purpose, or ethics from evolution? You can't. Evolution is simply a theory about the process and patterns of life's diversification, not a grand philosophical scheme about the meaning of life. It can't tell us what to do or how we should behave. And this is the big problem for many believers, who want to find in the story of our origins a reason for our existence and a sense of how to behave. Most of us do need meaning, purpose, and moral guidance in our lives. How do we find them if we accept that evolution is the real story of our origin? That question is outside the domain of science. But evolution can still shed some light on whether our morality is constrained by our genetics. If our bodies are the product of evolution, what about our behavior? Do we carry the psychological baggage of our millions of years on the African savanna? If so, how far can we overcome it? End quote. Okay, so this is where I begin to grow frustrated with this author. And I grow frustrated in the same way with many people who talk about evolution. I was a little bit frustrated in the same way with the author of Darwinian Conservatism. And it's because there's a notion that somehow evolutionary theory has no impact on our beliefs. It creates no change. And in that book, Darwinian Conservatism, it seemed as though the author was proposing that a Christian conservatism and a Darwinian conservatism are essentially the same thing. They arrive at the same point through different routes. Different justifications for why conservatism is correct, but ultimately conservatism is conservatism, whether it's Christian or Darwinian. And to me that made no sense, and I pointed that out in that episode. there's no reason whatsoever to believe that a conservatism built around Darwinian principles would exactly resemble Christian conservatism. There's no reason to think that. There's no reason to say that unless you're trying to avoid rocking the boat too much. You don't really want to say that Darwinism has a fundamentally different ethical framework than Christian conservatism. But I think that it does. Now, if it diverges too far, then it's no longer conservatism, and you shouldn't call it conservatism, right? It's something else entirely. But if it's within the same general sphere, enough that you could call it some form of conservatism because it's closer to conservatism than it is to progressivism, then you can adequately say this is Darwinian conservatism. But you should, I think, acknowledge that somewhere along the line there are going to be differences. There are going to be different priorities. There are going to be different beliefs. There are going to be different policies based on having a different foundation for your system of beliefs, for your ethics, for your whole worldview. There's no reason to think that two completely different worldviews would yield the same exact moral system or set of political policies. There's no reason to think that. It's just a sort of a dodge from having to explain what the difference really would be. And I think the author here does a little bit of the same thing. In the previous section where we talked about sexual selection, I made it clear, and the author made it clear as well, that it's not just biological differences between males and females. There are behavioral differences between males and females. And this is because evolution doesn't just guide our bodies, but it guides our brains. It guides our behaviors. Males and females behave differently, are attracted to different things, because evolution has prompted them to have different behaviors. Evolution absolutely affects our behavior. And so when he says evolution is simply a theory about the process and patterns of life's diversification, not a grand philosophical scheme about the meaning of life. It can't tell us what to do or how we should behave. Well, evolution has guided our behavior, and I think that it can indicate to us how we do behave and how we should behave. And I think there's this common belief that you can't get an ought from an is. And that's, I think, a little bit, well, I think it's wrong. I think that you can get some form of an ought from an is when you understand what the consequences of different types of behavior are. What are the consequences? What are the ends of human existence? What is the point of our lives? What are we after? What should we do to get there? What should we do to get to our objective, to accomplish our objectives? To say that evolution has nothing to say about meaning, purpose, or ethics, I think that's ridiculous. How we got here and what forces prompted us to become the way we are, or what forces prompted life forms to arise in their form, right? If replicating molecules initially were just floating in a primordial soup, and over time they built up around themselves cells to protect them and to enable them to replicate in safety, and they created means of replication via these cells, and through evolutionary processes, these protocells, these primordial cell-like structures that surrounded the replicating molecules eventually became us, then that says something about why we're here. It says something about what we are, and it says something about what we should be doing, what our objective is. It's not just a meaningless theory that has no bearing on our day-to-day lives. It has no bearing on our ethics or our morality. That's a cop-out, I think. It absolutely has bearing on all of the things that we do. So that's just where I get kind of frustrated. He says how do we find them, meaning, purpose, and moral guidance? He says we do need meaning, purpose, and moral guidance. And how do we find them if we accept that evolution is the real story? That question is outside the domain of science. No, it's not. Morality, purpose, meaning, these are not outside the domain of science. They're just questions that science is sort of hesitant and careful to really put forward answers to. Because they're unnerving, that our whole purpose is replication of our genetic code. That's why we're here. That's what we're here to do. Replicate our genetic code. That's it. All of our morality facilitates the replication of our genetic code. All of our morality enables us to have societies, and we have societies because the societies enable us to replicate our genetic code. Everything points back to genetic replication. There's no reason to think that it would point in any other direction. And he says, do we carry the psychological baggage of our millions of years in the African savannah? Well, of course we do. Of course we do. We carry all of the behavioral components of our evolution. We have only been in civilization for a few thousand years, a blip in the evolutionary scale. When we first built civilizations, we were more or less very similar to who we are today. There may have we're always evolving, and circumstances have changed enough that when circumstances change, that drives more rapid evolution. When circumstances stay the same, then we stay the same. So the rapid change in our environment has prompted some rapid change in evolution, physical evolution, mental evolution. I do believe this. But more or less, in the grand scheme of things, we are more or less very similar to what we were when we first developed our civilizations. So do we carry that psychological baggage? Absolutely we do. Of course we do. And he says, if so, how far can we overcome it? And I guess a question that remains unanswered and perhaps even assumed is that why would we want to overcome it? Why would we want to overcome our evolutionary so-called baggage? Maybe it doesn't fit as well in our modern world. There are some aspects of our inherited behavioral traits from the African savannah, if you will, that no longer work as well in civilization. Like, for instance, the pursuit of sweets. When sucrose and sugary things were hard to come by, we craved them and we pursued them. And now with technology, they line our shelves, and our evolutionary disposition toward eating sweets has become maladaptive, right? There are some things that were good in the wild, and they're not as good in civilization. They worked for us in the wild, and they don't work for us now. So in some sense, there are things that we may say we want to overcome this, we want to find a way around this conflict, but it's certainly not the case that we want to or can really truly escape from the traits we've acquired. Anyway, moving on from there, he says, quote, a common belief about evolution is that if we recognize that we are only evolved mammals, there will be nothing to prevent us from acting like beasts. Morality will be out the window, and the law of the jungle will prevail. This is the naturalistic view of ethics that Nancy Pearcey fears will pervade our schools. As the old Cole Porter song goes, they say that bears have love affairs, and even camels. We're men and mammals. Let's misbehave. A more recent version of this notion was furnished by former Congressman Tom DeLay in 1999, implying that the Columbine High School massacre in Colorado might have Darwinian roots. DeLay read out loud on the floor of the U.S. Congress a letter from a Texas newspaper suggesting, sarcastically, that the massacre couldn't have been because our school systems teach the children that they are nothing but glorified apes who have evolutionized out of some primordial soup of mud. In her best-selling book, Godless, The Church of Liberalism, conservative pundit Ann Coulter is even more explicit, claiming that, for liberals, evolution lets them off the hook morally. Do whatever you feel like doing. Screw your secretary. Kill grandma. Abort your defective child. Darwin says it will benefit humanity. Darwin, of course, never said anything of the sort. But does modern evolutionary biology even claim that we're genetically hardwired to behave like our supposedly beastly forebears? To many, this impression came from the evolutionist Richard Dawkins' immensely popular book, The Selfish Gene, or rather from its title. This seemed to imply that evolution makes us behave selfishly, caring only for ourselves. Who wants to live in a world like that? But the book said nothing of the kind. As Dawkins shows clearly, the selfish gene is a metaphor for how natural selection works. Genes act as if they're selfish molecules. Those that produce better adaptations act as if they're elbowing out other genes in the battle for future existence. And to be sure, selfish genes can produce selfish behaviors. But there is also a huge scientific literature on how evolution can favor genes that lead to cooperation, altruism, and even morality. Our forebears may not have been entirely beastly after all, and in any case, the jungle, with its variety of animals, many of which live in quite complex and cooperative societies, is not as lawless as the saying implies. End quote. So here we get some more areas that I find a little frustrating. And I think that he's basically, he's right at first when he says that what this naturalistic view of ethics that Nancy Pearcey fears is that that the world, the jungle has no morality, and that we will begin to act like animals, and we will have no moral codes if we embrace our animalistic natures. And here's where I think that there's a little bit of truth in the fear, and there's a little bit of truth in what is feared. And to get into that in more detail, let me jump to the end of this section where he says, in any case, the jungle with its variety of animals, many of which live in quite complex and cooperative societies, is not as lawless as the saying implies. The jungle is very lawless. This sort of glorification of the cooperative systems of nature, the vast majority of nature is not in any sort of cooperative system. To the extent that it is cooperative, it is inadvertently cooperative. The bee pollinating the flower is not trying to help the flower, is not being altruistic toward the flower. It's taking from the flower, it's feeding on the flower, and the flower benefits through pollination because evolution has led it to do that. But ultimately, the wild nature is all about feeding on other living creatures, killing and eating other living creatures. Nature red in tooth and claw. And a lot of times in order to sort of kind of gloss over what evolution is saying, we sort of say, well, nature's not really red in tooth and claw anyway. So if we're sort of naturalistic about our morals, it doesn't mean that we're going to be wild beasts because, nature is really cooperative. This, I think, is sort of disingenuous. Nature is brutal. Nature is bloody. Nature is deadly. Nature is painful. Nature is also beautiful, obviously. Nature is rewarding and refreshing and a good thing. I'm not in any way anti-nature. But I think that we should accept that as we kind of if we want to live in accord with nature, we should understand and accept what that means, right? We live in a brutal world. So when he said in the previous section, we've got this psychological baggage from our millions of years on the African savanna. In our civilization, we've tried to overcome this psychological baggage, so to speak. We've tried to take the tendencies that we acquired, the behavioral tendencies that we acquired in this brutal world of nature, and tone them down in order to live in society. And we've become, here's the truth, we've become sort of soft. We've become sort of flabby as we've let our technology and our civilization do things for us. And we have to find ways of going to the gym and exercising to make up for the fact that we are no longer fit because we allow society, civilization, and technology to do our work. So now we have to make up for it by finding quasi-recreational forms of work, right? So, and the same thing applies as we offload our thinking to computers and machines. Just like our body becomes flabby, our brains become flabby. and we become sort of soft, and we think that we have transcended the African savanna. We think that we're in a new world. We have a new set of morals. We don't want to carry those old, brutal morals with us. And so the question is always some sort of wavering between, well, nature is not really that brutal anyway, and on the one side, and then on the other side, well, even if nature is brutal, like, we can escape from it, we can transcend it. Once we're in societies, we're no longer bound by that. We're no longer constrained by our evolutionarily acquired behaviors. We can move past it. We can build for ourselves a new morality of our own design. And this starts to sound like Sartre and his version of existentialism. We don't, and this is, of course, the unconstrained vision that I've been talking about since the very beginning of this podcast, the difference between the constrained and the unconstrained vision. Our vision is, our behavior is constrained, our societies are constrained, and we are constrained by the habits we have acquired evolutionarily that are hardwired in our brains that we acquired through the millions of years of evolution. And on the one hand, we can't really transcend this. We can't really escape this. Now, we're plastic in some sense. Our brains are flexible and plastic, and we can build societies that have norms that push against some of the things that we've acquired in the wild. But we can't entirely escape it, right? So we are constrained in what we can do based on human nature. This is the premise of Thomas Sowell's book from way back when. Although he didn't really talk about evolution, we are constrained in truth because we have a human nature, and we have a human nature because of evolution. And we can't escape from it. But secondly, to the extent that we can escape from it, we wind up creating situations in which we adopt maladaptive traits. That we have traits that work in civilization but didn't work in the wild under the presumption that we are in civilization and we don't need those old traits anymore. But like we saw when we looked at Thomas Hobbes, the state of nature is never gone. It's only just held at bay. It's only just outside the door, right? The state of nature is not something we have escaped. We've only temporarily built ourselves a sort of civilizational shelter in which we no longer have to face the state of nature, right? But we have left the African savanna, but the African savanna has not left us. It will come barging in. When the walls fall down, when the house of cards gets blown over, and the African savanna is on your doorstep, you will find yourself, through no decision that you have made, through no desire of your own, you will find that nevertheless, here you are in the state of nature once again. It has come to you. You can never escape from it. It will come to you eventually, or your children, or your children's children. And then you're going to find that your softness and your flabbiness that you've acquired by offloading and outsourcing all of the brutality and the work and the strenuous activity to the machines, and by believing that we live in a cooperative world that doesn't really reflect the state of nature, you'll have no idea what is happening. You'll have no idea what has become of your civilization. You'll have no idea what to do now. You will have lost the habits necessary to survive in the wild, and you will be eaten alive because you've lost those brutal traits that you once had in favor of civilization. So, thank you very much for listening. I will leave it at that, and I'll talk to you again next time.